On today's video, I want to talk about a brand new office that the White House has just unveiled. It's actually technically called the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I would actually say that a secondary subtext name might be the Office to Rescind Civil Rights.
Hey everybody, so I have some big news to share. We are announcing the creation of the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And we are doing this work in large part because of the activism, the organizing, the marching, the voting of all of you leaders, be it students, parents, teachers, community leaders, who understand that living free from gun violence should be a right. So we're going to work on this together. We're going to continue to fight for reasonable gun safety laws and for the ability of all people to live their best lives free from fear, free from violence. Thank you for all that you have done and continue to do.
You know, at first blush, it's very easy to dismiss this thing, but I think it's instructive to where the other side is coming from and kind of where the future battles potentially lay. So we're going to go through this sort of point by point. And, you know, for those of you who are watching this video that actually believe in constitutional protections and, you know, the very basic foundations of our nation as a constitutional republic, you're probably going to get upset. Sort of fair warning on that one. Whether or not this office has any chance of producing anything that could theoretically affect our rights, I'm not terribly concerned, but it is out there and it's something that does need to be discussed. The first thing that's interesting is how the nomenclature has shifted. All right. So, you know, obviously we still use the term gun control, right? And those that sought initially to restrict our ability to exercise our civil rights also embraced the concept of gun control. After all, it's far easier to ban hardware than it is to actually control people's behavior, at least in their mind. Then there was this nuanced shift where all of the anti-gun groups started arguing for gun safety. I mean, after all, who would be antagonistic to gun safety, right? Unfortunately, their view of gun safety meant essentially the elimination of guns, all right? Then it is now morphed to gun violence prevention. And what's interesting is that what they do, or what they're articulating, what they're advocating for, actually really doesn't have anything to do with gun violence. It has to do with just general prohibition. So the underlying goal hasn't really changed. It's just how they shift their nomenclature, you know, tends to change over time, I guess, based on what some MBA with a marketing degree would, you know, suggest is more palatable for the general public. In any event, this new Office of Gun Violence Prevention will be putatively headed up by the Vice President of the United States. She will be the figurehead in control. Now, Vice President Harris used to be the Attorney General here in California, which is where I'm from. So I have some sort of, I would say, pre-existing knowledge of Kamala Harris. And, you know, I was taught at a very early age, if you can't say something nice about someone, it's best not to say anything at all. So my commentary about Kamala Harris is thus. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, I don't think Kamala Harris is going to have tremendous level of control over this particular office. Instead, the power is going to be vested in three specific individuals, and I do kind of want to go over them. Stephanie Feldman is going to be the executive director. Now, Ms. Feldman has worked in the White House under the Obama administration and under the Biden administration for about 10 years. She has a Juris Doctorate degree from Harvard, or from Yale rather, So in all candor, what they are looking to promulgate, she should know better, all right? One might even argue that without her qualified immunity as being a government employee, by simply articulating these positions, she may be engaged in malpractice. All right, the next person on the hit parade is Greg Jackson. Mr. Jackson comes to us from the Community Justice Action Fund. This is an organization that has sought to restrict gun rights, and evidently he is going to be now educating us on gun violence prevention. The last of the tripartite here is Rob Wilcox, and Mr. Wilcox has spent the bulk of his career at Everytown for Gun Safety. Again, this was one of those organizations that started off, it was essentially an outgrowth from the Brady Gun Control Group. They changed their name with Bloomberg's assistance to Everytown for Gun Safety, and this again was supposed to be more palatable. I will tell you that from all of the background information that I've read, Ms. Feldman, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Wilcox do not have a tremendous amount of at least articulatable experience working with firearms, training people with firearms, explaining responsible, use of firearms. And yet they are going to be the ones that are essentially making up the agenda for those of us who do. And this is very consistent with ideologue-based politics, right? You take individuals that are not subject matter experts and you put them in control of everyone else, all right? I mean, this would be the same level of idiocy as to elevating me to being the director of national policy as it relates to cardiology. Trust me when I tell you, my knowledge of cardiology is probably less than any one of my viewers here, okay? This is consistent. We don't see anybody being put on this board from the NRA, from the USCCA, from, NSSF, or any one of the other organizations that actually could provide some level of insight. So what is it that this office is going to do? Well, it's going to be a centralized advocacy group, basically. I mean, what they are essentially doing is taking what we sometimes refer to as NGOs or non-governmental actors. Any one of the civil rights organizations for gun rights, they are effectively NGOs. What they're doing is they're now creating a government connection point for the anti-gun NGOs, right? So everything will now be coordinated through this government centralized location. Again, whether or not this has any legitimate effect on legislation coming out of Congress remains to be seen. They definitely want to use the executive branch of government to promulgate a bunch of rules which would be patently unconstitutional. And as I've mentioned in a previous video, after this next Supreme Court cycle, it might very well come out that with Chevron deference being overturned, these individual administrative agencies won't have any legitimate control either. So, in a sense, it might be much ado about nothing. But I do want, because they actually put this out on the White House website, I want to go over sort of the key important things that they feel that they need to be able to do. They want to ban so-called assault weapons, and along with that, standard capacity magazines. They want to require safe storage for all firearms. They want to require background checks for all transfers. And they want to eliminate gun manufacturers' liability. And then lastly, because I think they are tone deaf right now to their own political party, they want more police on the streets. Now, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail because I don't believe they're asking actually for more police on the streets. What they're looking for are more officers with arrest powers to be hired by executive agencies for the purposes of going after gun owners, okay? And again, where the nexus is with all these things that I just mentioned and gun violence, that absolutely remains to be seen. In fact, the fundamental causes of gun violence, ironically enough, are completely absent from this entire thing. So let's go through these things one at a time. They want to ban assault weapons and standard capacity magazines. Okay. We've talked about this several times before. What exactly is an assault weapon? We won't go into all of the arguments about cosmetic features and all that kind of nonsense. And certainly standard capacity magazines don't lend themselves towards violent conduct, okay, any more than the presence of automobiles lend themselves towards individuals getting intoxicated and driving them. Executive agency can try to do whatever they want, and they can advocate and they can bully pulpit and everything else. I think that particular context is utterly meaningless. Hey guys, I'm going to pause this video for just a moment. So USCCA, which is sponsoring this video, they're doing a giveaway. It does end soon. Now, if you link on the description below this video, you can see all about it. But you're gonna want to participate before it ends. Definitely do so. All right, let's go back to the video. Requiring safe storage for firearms. So this how I guess would become sort of a federal thing. The issue here is I'm not sure that we actually have any federal jurisdiction that would allow them to promulgate that. And they really don't talk about what safe gun storage is. In every household, safe gun storage is going to be different. Clearly, in a home where you have a bunch of toddlers, leaving a gun in a nightstand drawer may not be considered adequate safe storage. On the other hand, somebody living alone, that might be considered completely acceptable storage. On top of everything else, and that's usually something that's relegated to the states. I'm not entirely sure I understand why there would be a federal involvement on this, or even a federal nexus to begin with. Again, this all being said, how this reduces gun violence becomes really kind of a query. On top of everything else, if someone that is a prohibited person is able to access your firearm and uses it in an illegal act, you're liable for that. All right. So the law, the penalties, they already exist. Okay. Requiring background checks for all transfers. So this is effectively a form, or at least the initiating form of gun registration. Most states, especially states like mine, except for a very, very small type of exemption to that, all gun transfers require background checks. So I'm not entirely sure, and I've never really seen data on this, on how many gun transfers occur in the United States without a background check. My suspicion is that it's actually a pretty small number. Eliminating gun manufacturers' liability. All right, so this one really gets me upset. All right, so there is a mantra that we hear out of the White House. In fact, we hear it actually from a lot of different anti-gun advocates, that gun manufacturers enjoy this unique form of liability protection, that Congress created this unique exemption where a gun maker cannot be sued. So that argument is what we call a lie. That is factually inaccurate. I won't even go so far as to call it propaganda. It's just complete BS. If Winchester or Remington or Perazzi were to manufacture a gun that was defective, and as a result of that product defect, someone was killed or injured, they are 100% liable for that. In fact, they actually fall within a context that we call strict liability. So, the idea that a gun manufacturer can't be sued is just absolutely outlandish. The firearm, and I always forget the exact nomenclature of the federal law, but essentially the Protection of Lawful or Commerce in Firearm and Arms Act, which I believe is what it's actually called, that created an immunity if the gun manufacturer's product was being used in an improper context. This was done specifically to protect gun manufacturers who make the products so that we can exercise our civil rights from being sued out of existence for lawsuits that bore no relationship to the product that they actually made. Now, you need to understand something. Every time a defendant is sued, whether or not that defendant has done anything illegal, well, not illegal, anything that would create civil liability, okay, because we're talking about a civil suit. Every single time a defendant is sued, there is going to be a cost involved in that suit. At a very basic level, we could probably say a lawsuit to defend is going to cost at minimum about $25,000. So if thousands of lawsuits that have absolutely no merit are levied against a manufacturer, even though they would prevail on every single one of those lawsuits, they're going to go out of business. They're going to go bankrupt because they simply will not have enough cash to be able to defend each and every one of them. And if their insurance companies are covering the cost for all these defenses, the insurance companies are going to sit there and say, look, if you want to continue to have liability protection, we're going to increase your rates 5,000%, or we're going to drop your coverage altogether. So as a practical matter, a gun manufacturer would not be able to have any liability insurance, and that would cause them to go out of business. If someone uses a hammer to murder someone else, Stanley Hardware, the manufacturer of that hammer, is not liable for the existence of the hammer. The weapon or the hammer is being used now as a weapon, and it's being done so in a method that was not intended by the manufacturer. Firearms manufacturers make weapons for two purposes: self-protection and recreational shooting. That's it. Okay, so if you're using a firearm in a recreational capacity, then you are engaged in conduct that the manufacturer intended it to be engaged in. If you're using the firearm to defend your existence, then you're using the firearm in the manner in which the manufacturer intended it to be used. If you're using the firearm to victimize someone else, well, number one, you are now the utter definition of a tyrant. But number two, you're using the firearm in a manner in which the manufacturer did not intend for it to be used. And as a result of that, they are effectively going to be able to get a motion for dismissal, all right, or at least a motion for summary judgment. So, they would like to take that protection away so that these gun manufacturers legitimately can be sued out of existence. The executive branch of government doesn't have the ability to negate a law that Congress came up with. So there you go. And then lastly, more police. Well, we've seen this political party that's in charge of the White House make all sorts of statements over the last 5 years on how we need to defund the police, how we need to remove the police. And yet, there are groups of executive agents that they have absolutely no issue in increasing their numbers, be it the FBI, the ATF, the IRS. All right, so they're looking for more police, and there is, of course, again, this nexus to gun control. So what would these police agents be doing? Well, they'd be enforcing executive gun control regulation, irrespective of whether or not that regulation is constitutional. So yeah, there are things here that could very well be problematic. Will they be able to overcome something called the U.S. Constitution. It's highly doubtful, but it does make a good PR stunt. It also, quite candidly, does create an impetus for our side to receive donations. And I would recommend that you do so, right? Every time anti-gun groups try to promulgate some form of gun control, the net result of that are more donations to civil rights organizations, right, that protect our gun rights. And those donations do go to defend lawsuits as well as to prosecute lawsuits to challenge these unconstitutional laws. So, as I saw recently when someone received money for a gun buyback program, and don't get me started on that. They received money from it. They used that money to fund a donation to a gun rights organization, which I found to be quite amusing. I would suggest that we all do the same. In any event, if you have any questions, by all means, contact me at steven@artemishq.com. And as always, train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.
Before you go, you just missed one of our best videos that got over 500,000 views. Click right here to watch it now.